Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the Ryzen 5 5600X. We're going to see if it is still worth it in 2024. We're going to see if it's worth it to upgrade from your previous system. For example, if you already have like an AM4 board, just slapping 5600X if you're upgrading from like a second gen, third gen Ryzen 5. Or if it's worth it to build a completely new gaming build using the Ryzen 5 5600X as your CPU in 2024. Me and my boy Klaus are gonna get down to the bottom of this. Excuse me, sorry. We're gonna do some benchmarks, we're gonna do some gaming, we're gonna go balls deep to figure out if the Ryzen 5 5600X is worth it in 2024. It's going to be pretty sicko mode. So before we get started, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. And every video I post will be more sicko mode than the last. All right, let's get to it. First things first, I'm gonna hand it off to my boy Klaus. And he's going to talk about the specs of the Ryzen 5 5600X. Okay, never mind. Let's talk about the specs of the Ryzen 5 5600X. The Ryzen 5 5600X is currently priced just shy of $150, and it came out way back in 2020 and was meant to be a competitor to the i5 10600K. BOFA. You may ask, what's BOFA?
These nuts.
Both of these processors had 6 cores, 12 threads, which is pretty standard. The 5600X has a TDP of 65 watts, which means that it's pretty energy efficient, especially if you compare it to modern CPUs that are super power hungry. Supports PCIe 4.0, still uses DDR4 RAM. Now for gaming, that's not really much of a drawback because you don't really need DDR5 RAM, and DDR4 RAM is still cheaper. This CPU does come with a stock cooler, which does an okay job. But I'd still recommend you upgrade your cooler for better temps and for a more sicko mode look. Now you could make the argument, why not upgrade to the Ryzen 5 7600? Well, that is a good option. You definitely have more of a future-proof system. When you compare the two CPUs, you're getting 6 cores, 12 threads on both CPUs, faster clock speeds on the 7600, same amount of L3 cache. The 7600 is using the newest Zen 4 architecture, which is 5nm technology. The 5600X is using Zen 3 architecture, which is 7nm technology. So more transistors, which means a faster CPU with the 7600. But anyways, if we're talking about price, the 5600X is still cheaper by about $70. And if you compare the prices of an AM4 and an AM5 motherboard, there's a difference of about $60. And I made sure to pick out the same board from the same manufacturer, just the B550 version and the B650 version for AM5. And then I picked out 32 gigs of RAM from the same manufacturer with RGB. So total for the 7600 is 528 versus 369 for the 5600X, saving you a total of $159. That may not sound like much, but that's enough to get you a better air cooler, a 1TB NVMe SSD, and a decent case with RGB fans. Not only that, AMD CEO Lisa Su has promised 5 years of updates for its AM4 CPUs. The AM4 platform isn't going anywhere. However, that was 2 years ago, so there's about 3 years left. But still, is the 5600X still worth it for the next 3 years? I wanted to find out. So me and my boy Josh Allen went ahead and built a brand new system using the 5600X. This is what we're going to use to test and benchmark our CPU. So let's go ahead and go over the specs inside this bad boy. Obviously we're using the AMD Ryzen 5 5600X. It's being cooled by the nzxt Kraken 120 liquid AIO cooler. The motherboard we're using is a Gigabyte Aorus Pro B550 Mini ITX motherboard, 32 gigs of Corsair Vengeance RAM, DDR4 3600MHz with RGB, a 1TB WD Black SN850X NVMe SSD. The GPU we're using is a Gigabyte Aorus Elite RTX 4060 Ti. Unfortunately, this GPU is not only a thick boy, but it's also a long boy, so it didn't really fit in the case. but it's okay, me and Klaus found a way to make it work. This isn't a long-term solution, but for testing purposes, it works. Bruh. An 850 watt EVGA power supply, and it's all inside of the nzxt H210 case. Well, kind of inside. So the first test I ran was Cinebench. During the multi-core test, the 5600X gave us a score of 11,026, which for the time was impressive because it beat out its competitor, the 10600K. Now during the single core test, once again the 5600X was able to beat out its competitor and wasn't too far behind the Ryzen 7 5700X. Now the Ryzen 5 7600 on the other hand, is a big jump in improvement thanks to its 5nm architecture. And obviously it's much newer and has more bells and whistles. But it's okay, the 5600X can still hold its own when it comes to gaming. Which brings us to our first game. The first game I ran was Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now we tested this game both at 1440p and 1080p, and remember, we paired it with a 4060 Ti and ray tracing was on at ultra settings. With both resolutions we had very healthy average FPS numbers. The 1% and 0.1% lows is obviously better with 1080p, but honestly I had nothing to complain about when I went with either resolution. I would recommend you play this game at 1440p because this CPU and GPU combo handle it no problem. And if all you have is 1080p, well, that's okay. You'll get even better FPS. The next test I ran was Starfield. So in this game we played it at high settings with both resolutions. I wanted to make sure that we were able to average over 60 FPS, which we did. However, the 1% and 0.1% lows were very similar with both resolutions. Honestly, I think it's the game. Even when I had a 7800 XT, my 1% and 0.1% lows weren't very good. But still, the game is very playable, and if you look at the system requirements to play Starfield, the 5600X still outperforms the CPU they recommend for recommended settings. So if you're trying to play Starfield with the 5600X, you should have zero issues. After that, the next game we tested was Cyberpunk. So just like in Starfield, I wanted to make sure I could at least average 60 FPS with both resolutions. So at 1440p I turned ray tracing off and I did average 67 frames per second, and my 1% and 0.1% lows weren't far behind. Then at 1080p I did turn ray tracing on and I did average slightly better FPS than 1440p. But ray tracing kind of destroys your 1% and 0.1% lows, at least with the 4060 Ti. Now you can easily turn off ray tracing at 1080p and get much higher FPS, but honestly ray tracing makes this game look really good. So if you must have ray tracing, definitely do 1080p at ultra settings, but if you turn ray tracing off, 1080p or 1440p will do just fine. Now the next game we ran was Red Dead Redemption 2. Played this game at ultra settings, and 1% and 0.1% lows weren't that far off from each other. And remember, the higher the 1% and 0.1% lows, the less likely the game's going to be stuttering or having these weird little drops in FPS. Having a higher average FPS does help, but it doesn't always tell you the full story. And that's where the 1% and 0.1% lows come in. Now in this game, the 1% and 0.1% lows were actually very similar. Well, kind of, except for the 1% lows, there's actually kind of a big difference. But still, at both resolutions, I would probably still recommend 1080p if you're gonna go ultra settings. This GPU and CPU combo handle it no problem. But even at 1440p, the game was just fine. Oh, great heavens! And the final game we ran was GTA 5. So this game is over 10 years old, so I expected healthy numbers whether it was 1440p or at 1080p. Neither of my 0.1% lows dipped below 60 FPS, which made GTA 5 look buttery smooth. So if you have a high refresh rate monitor, 1080p is probably the way to go, but still at 1440p the game looked really good. No weird stutters or any choppiness. And while I was playing, I was trying to be like those climate protesters that are blocking the freeways, and it really wasn't working out for me, so it got pretty violent. It was pretty shocking to me that nobody cared about the climate in this game, not even the cops were helping out. So I said, F it. I'm not sure if I accomplished anything today. So, after all those tests, after gaming, after figuring out the data, what does this all mean? Well, it means
your mom's a hoe.
Not quite. But regardless if your mom's a hoe, the Ryzen 5 5600X for the last 4 years has been one of the most popular mid-level CPUs. And because it's $150 right now, it's kind of on the edge of being a budget CPU while still packing a punch. When you pair the CPU with the modern mid-level GPU like the 4060 Ti, you can play almost any AAA game at 1440p or at the least 1080p ultra settings. Now if you choose to go with a higher end GPU, it is worth it to go with a higher end CPU. Now what is the answer to, is the Ryzen 5 5600X still worth it in 2024? For the most part, yes. Like I said, if you're going with a higher end build, I would just skip over the 7600 and even the 7600X and just go with the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. After all, you are building a high-end build, right? I know a lot of people online are going to tell you to go with the 7600 and invest in DDR5 RAM and a newer, more expensive motherboard. But I'm here to tell you you don't have to. If you're thinking about upgrading your second or third gen AMD CPU, the 5600X should be something you should consider, especially for those people who play CSGO or Fortnite. There's no need to go with the newer 7000 series CPU. Honestly, if you play Fortnite, there's no need to go with the 5600X as long as you have a CPU that's not older than 10 years old. So whether you're thinking of upgrading just your CPU or you're planning on building a new PC on a budget, the 5600X is still worth it in 2024. For those people who are ballers and have a bigger budget, by all means go with the 7000 series AMD processor. I think it's very easy for people who are tech reviewers, myself included, to get caught up in all the latest and greatest technology. We almost forget that most people don't need the fastest CPUs or GPUs. In my i7 and i5 4790 and 4690K videos, there's so many people in the comments saying that they're still rocking these processors and it works for them. Yes, there's others who say that they need to upgrade, but that just goes to show there's a lot of people out there that don't really need to upgrade to an AM5 board and an AM5 processor. The 5600X would be perfect for them. So once again, yes, the Ryzen 5 5600X is worth it in 2024. Let me know what you guys think. Leave it in the comments below. And I hope this content was helpful. And if you like this content, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. Me and my boy Klaus and Josh Allen, we work real hard to try to give you the most Sicko Mode content as possible. If you have any video ideas, leave it in the comments below as well. And like always, have a Sicko Mode day.